By the age of 45, doctors said his body looked like that of an old man. He had everything: fame, money, beauty, millions of fans around the world. But every night, Errol Flynn reached for another drink, then another, until the man who spent his career playing fearless heroes could no longer save himself. He died at just 50 years old, and he wasn't the only one. Behind Hollywood's brightest lights were actors and actresses who slowly drank away their careers, their families, their health, and sometimes their lives. Tonight, we're looking at 12 Hollywood legends whose greatest battle wasn't on screen. It was with the bottle. And some of these stories are far darker than most people realize. Hollywood has always sold a dream: perfect smiles, red carpets, luxury, applause. But behind that glamorous image existed another world entirely. For decades, alcohol flowed through the movie industry almost as freely as money. Studio parties lasted until sunrise. Contracts were celebrated with champagne. Failures were buried with whiskey. For stars living under impossible pressure, drinking often became more than a habit. It became an escape. Some found their way back. Many never did. These are the stories of 12 Hollywood legends whose greatest performances couldn't save them from themselves. Few actors ever embodied Hollywood glamour like Errol Flynn. After starring in The Adventures of Robin Hood, he became one of the biggest movie stars on earth. Women adored him. Men wanted to be him. His smile, confidence, and effortless charm made him seem almost invincible. Off camera, however, Flynn chased excitement with the same intensity he brought to the screen. Lavish parties, late nights, heavy drinking. It wasn't occasional excess. It became part of his everyday life. Friends watched him consume enormous amounts of alcohol while laughing off every warning. Doctors repeatedly told him his body was beginning to fail. Flynn simply refused to listen. By his mid-40s, years of alcoholism had already caused severe liver damage, heart disease, and chronic pain. One physician reportedly remarked that Flynn's body resembled that of a man decades older. Even climbing a single flight of stairs left him breathless. The man audiences saw defeating armies on screen struggled just to walk across a room. Still, he refused to slow down. During a business trip to Canada in October 1959, Flynn complained of chest pains but dismissed them as exhaustion. Only days later, he suffered a massive heart attack. He was 50 years old. Hollywood had lost one of its brightest stars. But unlike many legends, Flynn died while he was still remembered as a leading man. The next actress watched something even more painful disappear long before her life did: her career. In the early 1940s, Veronica Lake was impossible to ignore. Her trademark hairstyle became one of the most copied looks in America. She starred alongside Hollywood's biggest names. Studios believed she would remain a star for decades. Instead, her career unraveled with astonishing speed. Alcohol gradually became more than an escape. It became a reputation. Directors described her as increasingly unreliable. Productions became more difficult. Offers slowly disappeared. So did the glamorous life she had once taken for granted. By the late 1960s, one of Hollywood's brightest stars had quietly taken a job tending bar in New York City. Many customers recognized her. Most assumed it couldn't possibly be true. One evening, a customer looked across the counter and finally asked, "Aren't you Veronica Lake?" She smiled politely, then answered with 5 unforgettable words. "I used to be." There was no bitterness, no anger, just quiet acceptance. Those 5 words captured the tragedy of an entire Hollywood career better than any headline ever could. The woman who had once served as an icon of glamour was now serving drinks to strangers who barely believed they recognized her. She died in 1973 at the age of 50. Hollywood had already forgotten the woman it once couldn't stop celebrating. Some stars lose their fame. The next man almost turned destroying himself into part of his public image. W.C. Fields built his career by making audiences laugh. His sarcastic delivery, dry wit, and unforgettable screen presence turned him into one of America's greatest comedians. Off-screen, however, alcohol became his closest companion. Friends said he rarely went anywhere without it. He often carried liquor hidden inside ordinary-looking water bottles making sure a drink was never far away. Of course, everyone knew. Fields even joked that he drank because water wasn't safe. Audiences laughed. His body didn't. Years of relentless drinking steadily destroyed his health. Despite repeated warnings from doctors, he never seriously changed his habits. As he grew older, the comedian who had once dominated the screen became noticeably weaker. His sharp wit remained. His body could no longer keep up. Then came one final twist worthy of one of his own dark jokes. On Christmas Day in 1946, W.C. Fields died. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew him. He had spent years mocking Christmas, yet that was the very day his story came to an end. Some celebrities tried to hide their addictions. The next actor made his impossible to ignore. Oliver Reed never tried to hide his drinking. In many ways, he seemed to embrace it. His reputation became almost as famous as his films. Stories of bar fights, outrageous interviews, and marathon drinking sessions followed him wherever he went. Producers often worried less about his performance than whether he would even arrive sober. Yet audiences couldn't look away, because beneath the chaos was undeniable talent. Reed possessed a magnetic screen presence that made directors willing to tolerate behavior that would have ended almost anyone else's career. By the late 1990s, he had landed one of the biggest roles of his life in Gladiator. It looked as though Hollywood was finally giving him one last great chapter. Then, during filming in Malta, Reed spent an evening at a local pub. According to witnesses, he challenged a group of younger sailors to a drinking contest. Round after round, Reed kept going. He reportedly outlasted every one of them. It became another legendary Oliver Reed story. Only this time, there wasn't another morning. Hours later, he collapsed from a heart attack. He was 59 years old. Director Ridley Scott was forced to complete Reed's remaining scenes using digital effects, one of the earliest major uses of CGI to finish an actor's performance after death. Even his final night felt like something people expected from Oliver Reed, a man who had spent decades turning reckless drinking into part of his legend. Sometimes, however, the stories that make someone famous are the very ones that destroy them. Spencer Tracy was one of the finest actors Hollywood ever produced. He won back-to-back Academy Awards. Critics admired him, directors trusted him, audiences loved him. Almost nobody knew how much of his private life was controlled by alcohol. His addiction wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It unfolded quietly behind closed doors. There were periods when Tracy managed to stop drinking. Friends believed he had finally beaten it. Then the cycle began again. For days, sometimes weeks, he would disappear. Studio executives quietly sent assistants to hotels, restaurants, and bars, searching for one of their biggest stars. Eventually, Tracy would return, ashamed, apologetic, promising that this time would be different. It rarely was. The pattern repeated itself for decades. Years of alcoholism damaged both his marriage and his health, leaving those closest to him constantly worried that one day he simply wouldn't come back. To the public, Spencer Tracy remained calm, dignified, and effortlessly brilliant. Behind that composed exterior was a man fighting a battle that few people ever saw. Some addictions are hidden in silence. Others unfold under the relentless glare of the world's cameras. Richard Burton possessed one of the greatest voices ever heard on film. Whether on stage or on screen, his presence was impossible to ignore. His romance with Elizabeth Taylor became one of Hollywood's greatest love stories. It also became one of its most destructive. Together, they were glamorous, passionate, magnetic, and often fueled by extraordinary amounts of alcohol. Burton never pretended otherwise. He once admitted, "I have drunk more than anybody I know." It wasn't an exaggeration. Friends described endless dinners that became all-night drinking sessions. Arguments exploded as quickly as romances rekindled. Newspapers followed every reconciliation and every separation. To the public, it looked glamorous. Behind closed doors, it was exhausting. Taylor later admitted that alcohol often intensified the chaos in their marriage, trapping them in a cycle neither could fully escape. As the years passed, Burton's remarkable talent remained. His health did not. The heavy drinking slowly took its toll. In 1984, Richard Burton died at just 58 years old. Many wondered how many more unforgettable performances the world might have seen had he been able to escape the bottle. Sometimes alcohol destroys a relationship. Sometimes it quietly destroys the person inside it. To millions of moviegoers, Margot Kidder would always be Lois Lane. Confident, quick-witted, fearless. She looked like someone who had everything under control. The reality was very different. Behind the scenes, Kidder struggled with emotional pain that grew heavier as the years passed. Alcohol became one of several ways she tried to silence it. Financial problems mounted. Relationships became strained. Work became increasingly difficult to find. Then, in 1996, her private struggles suddenly became public. Kidder disappeared for several days. When police finally found her, she was exhausted, frightened, and hiding in the backyard of a stranger's home. The photographs appeared around the world. For many people, it was shocking. Not because an actress had fallen, but because they suddenly realized how invisible suffering can be. Years later, Kidder openly discussed the importance of seeking help and speaking honestly about mental illness. She refused to hide her experiences any longer. Her legacy eventually became one of courage as much as tragedy, because surviving can sometimes require even greater strength than succeeding. The next actor survived as well, but his body would never fully recover from the damage alcohol had already done. Peter O'Toole possessed a wit almost as legendary as his acting. He often joked that he couldn't remember much of the 1960s because he had spent most of the decade drunk. Audiences laughed, his friends laughed, doctors did not. Behind the humor was a body slowly being destroyed by years of relentless drinking. Alcohol had ravaged his digestive system and severely damaged his health. Eventually, the situation became so critical that surgeons were forced to remove most of his stomach in order to save his life. Few actors survive an operation of that magnitude and return to the screen. Peter O'Toole did. Against all expectations, he continued acting for decades afterward, earning further Academy Award nominations and reminding audiences why he had become one of cinema's greatest performers. But recovery did not erase the damage. The surgery saved his life. It could not restore the years alcohol had already taken from him. Even after reducing his drinking, his health remained fragile for the rest of his life. His extraordinary talent endured. His body never truly did. Sometimes, surviving addiction doesn't mean escaping its consequences. Sometimes it simply means living long enough to carry them. Dean Martin convinced America that drinking was effortless. A glass of whiskey, a relaxed smile, a perfectly timed joke. Night after night, audiences watched him perform as though nothing in the world could ever shake him. Many people assumed it was simply part of the act, but behind the charm was a man who had spent years relying on alcohol as both companion and escape. Friends often admitted they could never tell where the performance ended and the real Dean Martin began. Then, in 1987, everything changed. His son, Dean Paul Martin, was killed when his military jet crashed during a training exercise. The loss devastated him. Those closest to Martin said something inside him disappeared that day. He withdrew from friends, performed less often, rarely smiled the way he once had. People who had known him for decades described a man who seemed to lose all interest in the life he had spent years entertaining. Alcohol no longer looked glamorous. It looked like grief. Sometimes addiction begins with celebration, sometimes it becomes the only thing left after tragedy. Elizabeth Taylor lived a life most people could only imagine. She was one of the most famous women in the world. An Academy Award winner, a global icon, a woman whose every relationship became front-page news. But fame couldn't protect her from addiction. As the pressures of celebrity mounted, alcohol became part of her daily life. What began as an escape slowly became dependence. Friends watched her physical health decline. Her marriages became increasingly turbulent. The glamorous image the public adored was beginning to crack. Eventually, Taylor reached a crossroads. She entered rehabilitation at a time when almost no major Hollywood star was willing to publicly admit they needed help. The headlines were relentless. Some called it embarrassing, others called it courageous. Unlike many names on this list, Elizabeth Taylor survived. But survival didn't erase the years addiction had already stolen. She later admitted that asking for help had been one of the hardest decisions of her life. Her story reminds us that even those who escape addiction never escape its consequences completely. Not everyone was given that opportunity. The next woman spent her final years fighting battles in front of an audience. To the world, she would always be Dorothy, the bright-eyed girl who followed the yellow brick road into movie history. But the real Judy Garland spent much of her life walking a far darker path. From childhood, studio executives pushed her beyond human limits. Long filming days, constant pressure, little sleep. As she grew older, the exhaustion never truly disappeared. Alcohol became another attempt to silence the pain. By the late 1960s, the damage was impossible to hide. During performances in London, audiences watched one of Hollywood's greatest stars struggle to finish songs she had once performed effortlessly. Some nights, the crowd rose to its feet before she even sang a note. They wanted to believe the old Judy Garland had returned. Other nights were heartbreaking. She forgot lyrics, lost her place, stood silently beneath the spotlight while the orchestra waited. Some audience members applauded to encourage her. Others grew impatient. A few even booed. Imagine spending your life becoming one of the most beloved entertainers on earth, only to have strangers watch your greatest battle unfold in real time. Those final concerts weren't remembered because of perfect performances. They were remembered because audiences witnessed a legend desperately trying to hold herself together. Less than a year later, Judy Garland was gone. She died in London in 1969. She was only 47 years old. For millions of fans, Dorothy never grew old. Judy Garland never had the chance. Only one Hollywood legend left behind an even darker warning. Before Marlon Brando transformed acting, before James Dean became a cultural icon, before Jack Nicholson captivated audiences, there was John Barrymore. He wasn't simply a movie star, he was considered one of the greatest actors America had ever produced. His performances were studied, his talent admired, his future seemed limitless. Then alcohol slowly began taking everything away. At first, the changes were almost invisible. Missed rehearsals, forgotten appointments. Friends dismissed them as harmless eccentricities, but the decline never stopped. Years of heavy drinking damaged his memory, weakened his health, and steadily destroyed the discipline that had made him extraordinary. Film studios no longer trusted him. Directors became reluctant to cast him. The man who had once commanded every stage he stepped onto struggled to remember his own lines. Friends described heartbreaking moments when flashes of the brilliant Barrymore suddenly returned, only to disappear again minutes later. It was as though they were watching two different men occupy the same body. One was a theatrical genius. The other was slowly being consumed by addiction. By the time John Barrymore died in 1942, at 60 years old, Hollywood had already begun searching for its next star. His legacy survived. The man himself did not. Perhaps that's the cruelest truth about fame. The applause always fades. The cameras eventually point somewhere else. But addiction doesn't care whether the audience is still watching. These stories span more than half a century. Different generations, different personalities, different lives. Yet they all arrived at the same destination. Fame gave them wealth, admiration, luxury. Everything most people spend a lifetime chasing. But it couldn't protect them from loneliness, from grief, from addiction. Hollywood remembers the unforgettable performances, the legendary premieres, the standing ovations. Families remember something very different: the slow decline, the broken relationships, the moments when the person they loved quietly disappeared long before they died. Because sometimes the darkest part of a legacy isn't the way someone dies. It's the years the world spends watching them fall, one drink at a time.